another time, a quilter would invite her neighbors over for a social to show off her quilt collection. Today, a tourney like this is part of many quilt shows to put us back in touch with old quilts and some that are special. My name is Pat Skye, and I'm a member of the Rio Grande Valley Quilt Guild. My husband and I moved from Oklahoma to Harlingen in 1980 with our 2 daughters and a dog. My husband is a retired radiologist from Valley Baptist Medical Center in Harlingen. To prove that he hasn't been idle since then, I'm here to tell you that he's learned to play freestyle, work the DVR, make his own lunch, make toast, and most wonderful of all, he can wash the dishes by hand. Actually, he did make the bed for us. My grandmother and my mother sewed, and I began sewing as a girl, but like many of you, it was clothing in home economics class. I made my prom dress and my going-away suit when I got married 52 years ago. I sewed a little for our girls, but not much. I made them each a quilt 20 years ago in Juanita Cook's class. When I went to work at Skeef's Fabric Store 13 years ago, I thought I better learn some more, and that's when my real learning about the quilt world began. Quilter's catalog suggests that there are approximately 23 million quilters in the United States alone. Rio Grande Valley Quilt Guild has 269 members, and our group Facebook has 161. Here's a poem that I think sets the tone of this talk. The Quiltin' Times Are A-Changin' by Cindy Thury Smith. For our great-great-grandmothers in quilting times past, a frugal quilter had to scrimp to make every scrap last. Today, wasting fabric is not such a crime. Today's what is scarce is a quilter's time. We collect patterns, no matter how intricate. We swap and we share to get something magnificent. Once templates were traced, fabric carefully scissored. Now we slice multiple layers. We're all OFA wizards. At one time, a 2-fabric quilt was a sign of status. Now watercolor quilts have hundreds of prints coming at us. Quilters used together at small local quilting bees. Now we congregate at conferences, national teachers to see. Like our great-great-grandmothers, our lives are busy and we're stressed. But with the beauty of our quilts, we feel we are blessed. As with great-great-grandmother, our quilting serves many goals: to give warmth, grace our homes, and feed our souls. Like that, 1788. The first quilts in this new country were whole cloth. Checking the history of Quilts, Massachusetts, I found that it was indeed a community at that time. It's the year that most of the 13 original states ratified our Constitution. It's 77 miles south of Boston, and it's at the time when Paul Revere and Benjamin Franklin lived there. It's the Cape Cod area where Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, and Woods Hole. Quilts is just before Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution on Buzzard Bay. Jutting out in the Atlantic Ocean, it was an easy place for the British to land. At that time, nearly all people were actively gathering and growing their own food. After 2 Quakers were hung in Boston for their belief, many Quakers moved to Cape Cod. Was our quilter a Quaker? In 1788, the date of our quilt, the first woolen mill was erected. By 1790 census, Quilts had 10 family heads. Quilts had 10 family heads of 68 individuals. Was our quilter one of them? Of course, I don't know our quilter's personal history, but because of the location and date, we have a picture of what her life was like. What's more, from the quilt, I think it's easy to see that she was very accomplished in her needlework. Was she wealthy? And because of the times, was she British? Did she have the luxury of stitching in the daytime? It was difficult to see at night with only oil lamps. No electricity until the early 1900s. Was she a leader's wife, a daughter? Where did she get this pattern of grapevines and wildflower? The fabric must have come from Great Britain. This color. Our quilt show appraiser, Lisa Erlandson, says it was originally white. A card accompanying this quilt calls this technique the trapunto Italian style cording. Whether this relief started in England or Italy, it was made famous by the Italians and so is often called Italian quilting. The backing is an open weave fabric for inserting the cotton cording into the quilt and channels. That's why this side is turned back. so you can see the back. And those stitches. With magnifying glasses, I counted 18 stitches per inch. But I have to tell you that I couldn't keep my eyes open in my counting. I had to blink and then I lost my place. But I told Lisa that, and she said 18, 19, could have been any number like that. So it's not far-fetched. In spite of the water stains and deterioration, this is a very beautiful piece. Our next whole quilt is owned by Marilla Sparhawk of Harlingen. This quilt came from her grandmother, who was born in 1868 in Bernardston, Massachusetts. That's in the north central part of the state. Marilla says that this family lived there quite a while. Marilla and this grandmother are DAR members through Samuel Cunnivel, a farmer in Bernardston. Isn't it interesting that the town was settled specifically for families of soldiers who fought in the King Philip's War? A document on the internet says one of the first settlers was a Samuel Cunnivel. From studying genealogy, I think Samuel Cunnivel and Samuel Cunnivel could be the same person, but that would require more research. Marilla calls this quilt a family heirloom, although unlabeled. It is quilted 8 stitches per inch with a crossed hatch spacing 1 1/4 inch with feathers around the center. Feathers are also incorporated into the cross hatching. The next whole cloth was made by Guild member Catherine Rose and quilted by Kathy Thomas of Little House Quilts in Colorado Springs. This is what she had to say about quilting this candlewick quilt. I have been a long arm machine quilter for the past 14 years, and more recently, a quilt pattern designer of Little House Quilts. I enjoy quilting all types of quilts and especially love those with handwork. When I received Catherine's candlewick quilt, I was in awe of its beauty and the amount of time she had spent creating it. Candlewicking is a form of whitework embroidery, and I definitely wanted to showcase and enhance her handwork with the quilting. I decided to densely quilt the background with matching thread color, allowing the candlewick embroidery elements to stand out. I used a tiny stipple around the center medallion of flowers and McTavishing in the area just outside the center of the scalloped areas. I wanted those flowers and vines to pop. In the more open areas, I quilted a leafy meander to achieve a free-flowing effect. Figure 8s filled the sashing, and the flowers and vines were echoed in the outer border to achieve a finishing touch. It was definitely a one-of-a-kind quilt that brought me much pleasure as the quilting brought it to life. This is what Kathleen has to say about her quilt. Why in the world would anybody want to make all those knots? I thought this over and over again before I finally made the last one. After Kathy finished with her superb long arm quilting, I knew why I wanted to make and finish this top. Kathy did her part in just a few days. I took over a year to finish the knots because I kept putting it away to work on other projects. We both agree that this is a beautiful quilt. My mother is the reason I placed this quilt in the 2014 show. She told me others needed to see it, so I did. After the votes were counted, the quilt was awarded 3rd place. Thank you. This is a broderie purse. As a continuation of the whole cloth bed coverings, broderie purse comes on the scene. Broderie purse is French for Persian embroidery and has come to refer to the lovely applique of printed chintz flowers and other motifs onto a solid fabric. As I understand it, India imported cotton fabric to England with designs of flowers and other themes from English art. The English textile industry was alarmed with the increasing popularity of this fabric and was fearful that it would interfere with their wool and silk trade. Eventually, there was a ban on the import or production of this printed cotton in both England and the colonies. It's possible that because this ornate fabric became so costly and difficult to get, that the women began cutting out these motifs and appliquing them to a whole cloth background and therefore covering more space. They were also made for show by the wealthy with leisure time. but the last part of the 1700s, Americans were producing the chintz fabric. The invention of Eli Whitney's cotton gin in 1792 played a significant role, and not long afterward, powered looms were up and running. Some fabric was produced specifically to be cut apart. These often included an urn or vase full of flowers for the center. After 1840, broderie purse was often seen in pieced quilts, with each block showing a different flower, bird, or other motif. This beautiful one from Lisa Erlandson was originally owned by the family descending from the first governor of the province of Carolina. The quilt is dated June 6, 1853, with 7 signatures. The family history claims that the stains on the quilt came from the oilcloth that was wrapped around the quilt and the family silver and buried during the Civil War. You can see the signatures. It's like they're written with a fountain pen in that beautiful writing of another time. We're moving on. Both art and luxury are as much a part of quilt history as craft and necessity. As more and more leisure time came about, crazy quilts. Both art and luxury are as much a part of the quilt history as craft and necessity. As more and more leisure time came about, crazy quilts were a rampant fad for the wealthy of the 1880s and 1890s. Women used the most lavish imported silk, velvet, and lace and set them off with extravagant embroidery, like the feather stitch, the herringbone, and the cross stitch, or any fancy stitch they could invent. They were used as elegant throws for the parlor sofa, but not for bed coverings. American audiences were drawn to the satin stitches used in English embroidery, as you can see in this crazy quilt, owned by Sandy Baggett, dated by our appraiser Lisa Erlandson as 1880. The design of a traditional quilt block is much less important in crazy quilts. The quilters are able to use much smaller and more irregular shaped pieces of fabric. As a textile art, crazy quilting is extremely creative and free-flowing. Quilters will often learn as much about embellishments as they will about the technique itself. Although crazy quilt styles may appear haphazard, hours were spent cutting shapes and trying out various arrangements of the pieces before sewing. Sandy's quilt has 42 8-inch blocks set side by side without sashing or borders. Embroidery designs include the Masonic symbol, flowers, teapot, various animals, including a cat and a peacock. There's an applique cross and a pieced fan. Some quilters believe that embroidering a spider on its web will bring good luck to the quilter. Crazy quilts occasionally include embroidered verses and information recording family events. This quilt edge finish is knife cut without a binding. Sadly, the quilts made with silk in them are rapidly deteriorating, in part because many Victorian silks were embedded with metals. Experts in quilt preservation do what they can to save the old silks, and when that is no longer possible, some take on the painstaking task of renovating the quilt while carefully preserving the original embroidery. Someday these historic quilts will be found in pictures only. The quilt from the Harlingen Museum was made for Roland Edward Rader. It has its name on it. It was made by his grandmother. Estimated date is 1896 because Roland's hand is on there. It says he's 3 years old. He was born in 1893 in Columbia, Missouri. When his grandmother drew his hand and proceeded to personalize a quilt for him, does it make you wonder what she was thinking about when she made the quilt? Do you think she thought about them leaving Missouri and that she might not see them again? Roland's parents were in Harlingen in 1920 farming. Roland worked with his father as a farm laborer and therefore was exempt from serving in the military. In 1930, he worked at a retail hardware store, and in 1948, he worked at Sears. His wife taught school. Both responsible and hardworking people, but it doesn't appear that it was too exciting. However, He must have been interested in his brother's part ownership of the first airplane in Harlingen. Now, don't you know that was exciting? The next quilt is owned by Florence Rosette of Harlingen. She purchased this quilt in Maine about 5 years ago. After 1900, women adapted their crazy quilting to using such fabrics as flannels, denims, and other cottons. They did not always put decorative stitches on them. Instead, they were often just simply pieced. This quilt is fluffy and made for comfort. It's machine made and hand tied. Vicki Guerra made this very ornate wall hanging 7 years ago, and the picture frame mat over to your far right 5 years ago. Both show that crazy quilting still captures the interest of stitchers today and would have been admired by any woman of the 1800s. Vicki's made a few of these picture frame mats, but I haven't asked her if she's made one for her new grandbaby. She's also made crazy quilt book covers. Vicki was born and raised outside Chicago, but moved to the Valley when she married her husband, as this is his home. She started sewing at age 8 and sewed clothing until her kids were in high school. She started quilting in the late 1990s. She's also has worked in other mediums such as wool, paints, mixed media, and colored pencil. She's won many ribbons and has done lots of commissioned pieces. Vicki is very productive. She enjoys teaching, and her classes fill up fast at Retreat and Friendship Day. She's given a class on miniatures, and another time she gave a talk on organization. I went right home and immediately started sorting. She does her best to sew at least a little every day. She says that's the only way you can improve. She herself likes to take classes and learn new techniques. She's been a judge for local competitions several times. She enjoys traditional quilting as well as contemporary work and innovative pieces. She's a member of 4Bs and the Rio Grande Valley Quilt Guild. As the craze for the crazy quilt faded, red work embroidery took its place. Women were willing to pay extra for turkey red thread dyed from madder root because it was color fast. Simple pictures were stitched with simple stem stitch. Designs were endless, such as animals, flowers, toys, and children. Pictures in children's books, magazines, and even advertisements were pattern sources. Initially, this embroidery was done on a variety of useful household items such as dresser scarves, tea towels, and cloth napkins. Magazine publishers gave away patterns to promote new subscriptions. New companies formed with catalogs selling patterns, thread, and accessories. In the 1870s, iron-on transfers were developed. How much easier it was to apply the design to fabric with a warm iron. In the early 1900s, women began using red work embroidery for bed coverings. As you can see from our coverlet from the Harlingen Museum, that's the one on the far right, sorry. Reprinted squares 8 inches across, ready to embroider, were sold. Because they were originally cost a penny a piece, they were called penny squares. After they were embroidered, they were sewn together without sashing. Often a stitch, and in this case the feather stitch, also in red, covers the seam line. Often, and in this case, there was no batting, and the front and back were joined with tied, in this case, yarn, but they could be tied with thread. Okay. Later, in more recent times, sashing was added, as in our sample from Vicki Guerra. According to the Times, she's added batting, sashing, and a border. She started the embroidery of these blocks in May of 2008 and completed the wall hanging in January of 2011. She named her wall hanging, "Every Quilt's a Learning Experience." Vicki is the one that believes in sewing a little every day. This is a traditional antique Carolina lily quilt made in the early 1880s. It's owned by Guild member Susie Evers. Is Susie here? And made by her grandmother and great-grandmother. It's all cotton, hand appliqued and hand quilted with a feather pattern surrounding the pineapple design. It has 9 stitches per inch. And Susie tells me that it's been shown. Okay, the next quilt is owned by Diane Hines. Her grandmother made this quilt in the 1950s in Texas, south of Fort Worth, in a farming community, and they called it Josh Away. She used a treadle machine and used feed and flour sacks for a lot of her projects. She entrusted Diane's granddaddy to get the right color when he went for more feed. Hand quilting was done in the winter. One summer she asked Diane which quilt she would like, which quilt top. Diane was about 8 years old. This Carolina lily is also all cotton, hand appliqued, and hand quilted. Diane says quilts were used without any special care. When they became too tattered, they were just thrown away. I counted 7 stitches per inch. Neither of these two quilts have labels, but they are in the family. Pat Daly has kept the first quilt she ever made. This was in 1985 in Holland, Michigan. I'm guessing she was in her 40s. She said she had good teachers sharing information and giving good tips. She used polished cotton and she has mitered corners. I counted 7 to 8 stitches per inch. She said that in her first quilt she didn't have regular stitch. And she did put her label on it, but just before she gave it to me. She personalized this small quilt by embroidering her name and date on the front. I think that's down near Nancy. She crossed the T in Pat with a needle embroidered from metallic thread. Isn't that cute? This is a quilt also without a label. My friend Florence Roseff of Harlingen bought it at a church rummage sale in Harlingen. The price was right, $25, and she's used it for grandchildren. It may not have a label, but I found out about it on the internet. It was one of the thousands mass-produced in China in the 1990s from a pattern sold to them by the Smithsonian. These reproduction quilts flooded the market and were sold in retail stores like Sears and Penny's and Walmart. Today, some have been erroneously sold as Americana antique in garage sales as well as antique shops and on eBay. If you are suspicious, check the quality of the fabric, the mass-produced cut of the pattern, no binding followed by a sparse quilting. I counted 5 stitches per inch. If you're not sure, see if there's a pillow sham. Or a plastic zipper. Grandmother's Flower Garden is one of the best loved of all patterns. This pieced hexagon quilt has its roots in England as far back as the 1700s and is called English paper piecing. Historians believe the hexagon pattern might be one of the oldest pieced patterns. Immigrants brought this pattern to America, and the earliest known American hexagon quilt is dated 1807. At that time, they were called mosaic quilts, or honeycomb quilts, or 6-sided patchwork. Godey's Lady's book published the hexagon pattern in 1835. The hexagon quilt was changed over the years from an overall random arrangement to the flower, often a yellow center surrounded by an assortment of colors and patterns. Hexagons come in a variety of sizes, come in various sizes from 1/2 inch to 1.5 inches that I know about. You measure one side. The fabric is cut to wrap around the hexagon a little more than 1/4 inch. After you hand baste it to the cardstock thick hexagon, you then whip stitch them together from the back side. The paper can be removed after you have them stabilized. Our first example is dated 1850 to 1875 from the Harlingen Museum. It's a baby quilt and is 34 inches by 42 inches. The quilter has taken liberty from the traditional flower. Each flower has been edged with triangles of the background fabric to fill the space, making it a smooth edge to attach to the background fabric. This baby quilt is hand quilted in an arc, working from the center to the edge. The next grandmother's flower garden came from my mother-in-law when she dismantled her home. It has a label on it that tells the story of the quilt as best we know. It came to me as a top, filthy and with holes. I washed it and began covering the holes with hexagons as best I could. store-bought hexagons weren't the same size. When I took a class from Gayleen Fitzgerald in Houston, I showed her the quilt and got her ideas. Since we're sure Grandma didn't make it, I went ahead and did a little artwork. I even added Sunbonnet Sue. Linda Garcia quilted it with her long-arm quilting machine using a flower pattern and dark green thread. The binding is with flour sacks that were found. You never know what will happen when you consent to go with a friend to take a quilting class. That's what Casino Richardson did 37 years ago. 2 years after taking the class, she opened a quilt shop. She's had her quilt shop in her home now for 15 years. She made this beautiful grandmother's flower garden from paper hexagons that she bought rather than cut from cereal boxes. It's made with fabric she collected from the late 1940s through the 1970s for repairing quilts. This quilt took 1 year for her to hand piece and hand quilt. She finished it 3 years ago, and it's her own design. She watched as quilting really took off in the 1980s and 90s. She saw cutting change from scissors to rotary cutters. She was ecstatic with new colors. She and her husband Gary are quilt collectors as well as makers. They own about 100 antique quilts and have made over 200 quilted items. Her quilts have been pictured in quilt magazines, and a TV station in Kansas City, Missouri interviewed her and did a video of their quilts on display in their home. She says there is a glaring mistake in that quilt that we just saw, but she couldn't find it to show it to me yesterday, so let's move on. The early signature quilts were based on friendships and were made as memories for a person or family. Single pattern quilts were often referred to as friendship quilts. These blocks could be quickly made from fabric scraps, and most signatures were embroidered. Occasionally, one person chosen for her beautiful handwriting would inscribe all these signatures. We tend to visualize a woman making and signing her block to be later sewn together with others. Although this was a common practice, there were other ways a friendship quilt could be created. Sometimes a single person collected bits of fabric from others, made a block from each person's contribution, then signed each block with that person's name. Individual blocks on a quilt may have been collected over several years, and sometimes they were put together into a quilt years later. No matter how they were made, they all had the same purpose: to record memories of cherished friends and family members. Imagine living in a time when families were large and women worked all day. A woman had to finish necessary sewing to provide clothing for the family before she could bring out her quilt fabric. Much of what we buy without a thought today had to be produced at home. Social time with family and neighbors was looked forward to. A quilting party was just what was needed. The quilt top would already have been pieced and the layers sandwiched together on a quilting frame, ready for the women to add their fine stitches. The men chatted, the children played, and the young adults got better acquainted. In this case of our friendship quilt here, the signatures are from the Gleaners Sunday school class from First Baptist Church in Harlingen. Mrs. T.W. Neff was president because it says so. Most are dated in July of 1932 because they put the dates on it. It's recorded in the Harlingen's first 100-year book that in 1932, the Depression had reached the valley. City employees were paid in script instead of cash. In August of 1933, Lon C. Hill, the city's founder, was honored with great fanfare. Then, 2 weeks and 2 days later, on Labor Day, a hurricane devastated Harlingen and the valley with intensive flooding and winds howling up to 125 miles per hour. It was called the Storm of 1933. Okay. It wiped out 90% of the citrus crop and left vegetable fields underwater. Some families camped out in hotels and were without electricity for 5 days. San Antonio and Houston sent relief trains and medical teams. Mosquitoes invaded. In 1935, when that quilt may have been assembled tent camps of poverty-stricken migrant workers, Anglo and Mexican-American dotted Rangerville Road. On a good note, the highway connecting Harlingen to Corpus Christi was completed. Can you imagine? And minimum wage was raised to 35 cents an hour. A bit of history triggered by a little research from a date and a place. It reminded me too much of Hurricane Dolly in 2008. Some of you may remember Gilbert in 1988, Allen in 1980, and Beulah in 1967. That quilt has no water damage. The Lone Star quilt is likely one of the most recognizable quilt patterns to Americans. It is also one of the oldest. There are variations of it with 6 points, 8 points, and even more, but 8 is the most common. The large star is made up of diamond-shaped fabric pieces. Often the colors are chosen and placed to form what appears to be concentric circles radiating out from the center. I suppose it's obvious for me to show it. Sometimes other small stars or flowers are placed in the blank areas of the star. In Texas, we call it the Lone Star because we are the Lone Star State. But other states and regions have called it the Mathematical Star, the Star of Bethlehem, Star of the East, or the Morning Star. The Amish have especially liked this pattern, as have the states in the South. Although many Lone Star quilts seem to have been started, not so many have been actually finished. Pieces, or just the top, are found in thrift shops. It seems that when it's laid flat, the center pooches up, or the sides are cockeyed and the corners are crooked. Intermediate to advanced skills are needed to make these stars because each and every tiny diamond has biased edges, and the triangles and the corners are set in with the Y seam. Today, if you're interested, look for a pre-printed foundation for piecing, foundation piecing. This beautiful yellow to orange Lone Star machine pieced and hand quilted belongs to Marilla Sparhawk of Harlingen. It was made by Sarah Sears, an ancestor born in Kentucky but living in Waukeeta, Oklahoma in 1941. This quilt has no label on it. This quilt has no label. But Marilla has kept a copy of a newspaper article. The article tells of Sarah, age 82, going to the governor's mansion in Oklahoma City to a quilting bee that was by invitation only. She chose the Rose of Sharon block to submit. No lady under 75 years of age could submit one. The party started with each woman quilting their own block. They ate a fine lunch and had some local entertainment, including the singing of Dinah's Quilting Party and a dancer dressed like Martha Washington. She was also a fine stitcher. The party ended with ladies dancing the minuet as well as the Virginia reel. When all the adieus and goodbyes were said, the common expression of each guest was, "I have never had such a good time." They arrived home about 9 p.m., a little tired but very happy. What a different time, huh? Behind the bed is the New York Beauty. The New York Beauty design was first documented around 1850 under such names as Rocky Mountain Road, Rail Through the Mountains, Split Rail, Crown of Thorns, and the Great Divide. In the 1930s, the New York Beauty name was adopted by Stearns & Foster Mountain Mist Batting Company for an old quilt pattern to be published as a new one. The idea was to publish a variety of quilt patterns to boost the sale of batting. It's possible that the name New York Beauty comes from the spikes that radiate out, much like the spikes on the crown of the Statue of Liberty and the newly finished Chrysler Building. Actually, it wasn't even popular in New York, but it was in Tennessee. However, the name stuck. Since the 1930s, the name New York Beauty has been associated with all quilts made with the same basic design of spiked quarter circles wedged in the corners of a block. Some have called it a sunset. Later, it was applied to even pre-1930 quilts. It's widely considered to be one of the most advanced quilt patterns to piece. Finding this quilt is rare, and it's exceptionally rare to find the spikes crisp, sharp, and straight, which makes this New York beauty that Ruth Anderson found at the Mission Flea Market for $8 a real surprise. It's 78 by 78. In the last 20 years, the New York beauty pattern has been translated into the contemporary quilt movement with many adaptations, many using foundation piecing. This next quilt belongs to Esther Cavazos of Harlingen. It was a block of the month from the Pumpkin Patch Quilt Shop in Victoria, Texas. Esther signed up for the pattern, the fabric, and for all the embellishments. Esther did all the hand applique. She did the hand quilting, 7 stitches per inch. Patty Levinson of Brownsville hand quilted the borders, and MiBelia In of Weslaco did the beading. Give us a wave. There she is. She did the beading and the silk ribbon embellishment. Esther called the quilt finished in February of 2014, and yes, it has a label. Good girl, right? Esther's been sewing and doing crafts for many years and obviously is very accomplished in applique. She uses rock sand glue to turn the edges of the pieces under. She glues one piece to another to complete the entire pattern before she glues it to the background and then stitches. She was born north of Harlingen and has lived in the area her entire life. She's made many friends by teaching others to sew. She has taken such an interest in them that they stop by to see her on a regular basis. She's an encourager, and I say these last things from personal experience. I hope you've seen the value of putting some kind of information on your quilt. These last 2 quilts are, I would say, more touching than we can bear. It's quilts made for a soldier, or a man or a woman who has interrupted her life to take up arms or support the cause for the freedoms and security that we have in this great country. This first quilt, owned by Lisa Erlandson, is from a World War II pattern published in the Farm Journal magazine dated February 1943. This top appears to be made from fee sacks and appears to be home dyed. Lisa says she has to use the word appears unless she is 100% sure. She estimates the date of the quilt from 1943 to 1945. The last piece is a wall hanging made by a daughter for her father for his 80th birthday. Chaplain Leo McDonald, or better known as Mac, spent 4 years in the Marine Corps and was stationed at Midway Island, but after the battle. The devastation he saw there guided him for the rest of his life, which he spent as a chaplain, 26 years in the Navy and 28 years on the faculty of the Marine Military Academy in Harlingen. He officiated at weddings and funerals. Each year his family would rent a house and spend some time together. That year it was Tennessee. Mac passed away last summer, just before his 90th birthday. His family wants to continue getting together once a year. One thing on their list is to try to understand this man that had a different calling. Are there any questions or comments?
Very nice.